Hello and welcome to the final video in the series on interests which override under the Land Registration Act 2002, Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. In this final video, I'm going to take you through my answer plan to the Boris and Teresa scenario that we looked at in the first two videos. But before I do, here's a quick reminder of the requirements a third party must satisfy in order to have an interest which overrides under paragraph 2. Here are the facts of the question, and I'm using the version where Boris doesn't visit Yellow Door and Jeremy has packed away all of Teresa's belongings and put them in the attic. And the first thing I would note is that I need to start my answer by explaining the general issue. So I need to explain what Boris requires advice about, because the examiner hasn't given us any guidance. As we saw in the first video, here's the general issue. It's quite a simple point, but a surprising number of students forget to include it. And it's also going to help us as an aide-memoire when we come to the end of our answer. So here's how I did it. So in a question on third-party rights, the first thing you'll usually need to do is to identify the interest the third party has in the land. Now the examiner might tell you this, or as in this case, you might have to identify the type of interest and explain how it has arisen. Now you might remember that in the first video I did this when I was applying the general rule under Schedule 3 paragraph 2. But that was because I was only looking at paragraph 2 at that point. In fact, you should deal with this point at the beginning of your answer, because if Teresa doesn't have an interest, then there's nothing that could possibly affect Boris after the sale. So if you remember from the first video, I used the case of Lloyds Bank and Rossett, which states that where a non-legal owner contributes towards the purchase price of land, they acquire a beneficial interest in that land. So as Teresa did contribute, Jeremy was holding Yellow Door on trust for himself and Teresa at the time of the sale to Boris. So having established that Teresa does in fact have an interest, the next issue is to explain how that interest can be protected when the land is sold. So the next thing I would do is to briefly explain how third-party rights are protected under the Land Registration Act 2002. Now you can explain this as your answer unfolds, but personally I prefer a quick overview at the start of your answer because I think that it helps to provide a better structure as it helps to signpost the key points that you're about to discuss. So I would explain that the rule is that third-party rights which don't need to be registered with their own title can either be a minor interest or an interest which overrides. Minor interests need to be protected by an entry on the register, but interests which override do not. I would also explain at this stage that some minor interests can have dual status, so they can also override under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. So in my plan, I would note that Teresa's interest is a minor interest which should be protected by a restriction on the register. So if it has been protected, it will take priority over the sale to Boris. But from the facts, we don't know whether the interest has been protected. So I would make a note that I need to consider whether it's going to override under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. But before I do this, I would very quickly check to see whether the interest was overreached or not, as this particular type of interest can be overreached if the purchase money is paid to two or more trustees, in other words, two or more legal owners. I'll check the facts and I'll note that Boris paid the money to a sole legal owner, which was Jeremy, so overreaching won't apply. And I would include that as a brief point in my answer. And here's an important tip. Always deal with overreaching before you start to look to see whether the interest overrides under paragraph 2. because if it is overreached, then the purchaser will take free of it, even if it would satisfy the requirements for an interest which overrides under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. Just also note that overreaching only applies where third parties have a beneficial interest in the property. So it doesn't apply to the other types of interests that we saw in the first video, such as an equitable lease or an option to purchase the property. So I would conclude that Teresa's interest wasn't overreached, so now I need to start looking to see whether it overrides under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. So as I explained in the first video, you would always start by looking at the general rule. And if you remember, we arrived at the conclusion that potentially she does have an interest which overrides. We don't have to explain how she acquired the interest again, so we don't need to go through Lloyds Bank and Rossett and apply it to the facts. But we do need to explain that this is the type of interest which can be both a minor interest and overriding. So if you haven't already done this in your answer, then you should do it now. And something else just to note, you don't need to put this in your answer, but just to note that a home right which protects spouse's occupation can never override under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2. So having concluded that she has satisfied the requirements for the general rule, then the next stage, as you know, is to consider whether either of the exceptions apply, which we looked at in the second video. So when we looked at Paragraph 2b, we concluded that a requirement hadn't been satisfied, so the exception doesn't apply. And if you remember, there is no need to go on and consider the second requirement because that is now redundant. And then we looked at the other exception in Paragraph 2c, and on this occasion we concluded that the requirements had been satisfied. So our conclusion at this stage is that one of the exceptions applies, so Teresa's interest does not override under Schedule 3, Paragraph 2, and then we need to complete our answer by explaining how the interest which overrides affects Boris. So I would quickly refer back to the general issue to make sure I answer it. I'd explain that Teresa did have an interest in the land, but it won't take priority over the sale to Boris. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found these videos helpful. This was my first attempt at adding a narrative to a YouTube video, so please excuse the fact that it's not particularly polished. But practice does make perfect, so I will be adding further content soon. Thank you once again, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and share my video or subscribe to my channel because it really does make a difference.